Doc Manco came up with an idea, and him and I would growl. He was a tough old guy. Him and I would growl at each other, and then he'd say, "Chuck, let's go to the corner and have a beer." And we'd talk about the course, and but he was just a wonderful person, I thought. And all those guys were. Jerry Sindelar, Andy Hornick, they were all, Stewart was on the thing. They were just down to earth people. All through the Depression, every penny counted. There was none of this, they watched the budget. Lloyd Taylor was the chairman of the finance thing. And if I was 15 cents over my budget, I'd get a call. "Chuck, I'd like to see you in the office." I says, "I know all about it." I says, I got it right here. I says, "Everything's all right." But they really watched the money. It was tight, And those guys were through the Depression, and they knew what hard times were, and there was nothing, every penny counted. So then Doc Manco had an idea. He says, "Chuck, I got a good idea." He said, "Why don't we put a flower pot," because we had all these stumps around from cutting down it. "Why don't we put a flower pot on those stumps? There's some flowers." I said, "I don't like that idea." I said, "The stump's going to rot. I mean, flower pots take more moisture because there's not enough soil in there. So we ground the stumps, and a gal by the name of Mrs. Rainey and Mrs. Connors, they wanted flowers. So they took over the flower thing. We prepared the beds. Most of the flower beds we had at that time were where a tree was taken out, because we had the stump ground and we put in soil, and that was a flower bed. Behind 3T, 14, 7, everywhere there was a flower bed. That's usually where a elm tree was. And those gals, there was probably 6 or 7 of them. They bought the flowers. We prepared the bed, they planted them, and then they carried their buckets out every day and watered them. That was the beginning of the flower program at the Lakewood Country Club. But a couple years later, Mrs. Rainey and Mrs. Connor had the flower bed on 10, which was one of the nicer beds because they had an arrangement of flowers in it. Well, they all got in an argument. One of the other gals wanted the flower bed on. She even had I helped her carry it out of her trunk of her car. She even had a bird bath put in the middle of it. They all got in a big argument and they all quit. So that's when I got into the flower business. And to be honest with you, we never had any flowers in Pittsburgh. I mean, in those days, people, if you mentioned buying flowers, they'd think you were smoking something because the money wasn't available. So there was a highway nursery up here in Center Ridge Road, and they grew flowers, and I went up there, and an old gal that one of the owners, Nana they called her, Mrs. Endress, she was really into flowers big time, and she helped me design some of the beds when I took the flower thing over. In fact, the old clubhouse had they had a dining area, if you're not familiar with, in the back, screened in, and the whole center row was flower boxes. And we had flowers down through the center of the dining area there. And that's how I got into the flower business, and then I really enjoyed it. I mean, and then as time went on, Doc Hughes was the boss. And he was a flower guy. He lived at Water's Edge. He moved on to Arizona or somewhere, and in the back of his place, he had all flower beds, and he really, I said, for a dentist, that's very unusual, But every time we did a project, in those days, we did it all. We built the greens, we built the tees, We did the tennis court, we painted the pool. I mean, we did everything. There was none of this outside help because, you know, and I always thought that was what was expected of me. That's what I was here for. And I enjoyed it. But every time we did a project, number 9T, when we built the new 12, every time we did a project, he'd say, don't forget the flower bed. And we always put flower bed in, you know, which I really thought, and a lot of the people thought it was very nice. But anyhow.
Excuse me, who was it that said that?
Pardon me?
Who forgot don't forget the flower bed, Wallers? Was that who said that, or you?
You said Stu Hughes?
What's that?
It was Dr. Hughes who said that?
Yeah, Doc Hughes,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Well, that was a flower thing, and we built the number 8th green, cleared the woods out, and in fact, Sindelar says, Chuck, he says, do you ever build a green? And I said, oh yeah. Well, it wasn't a complete lie because back at Elcoma, they had 2 Dapper Dans, which was like the Cleveland Open. And we extended 3 greens. And we did this all in-house. No architects in those days, you know, we just did it. And that old man Hazlett, he was very good at it. And I told Brian Silva, the architect they had here, I used to rag on him. I said, you guys are so full of shit. Well, anyhow, Hazlett took a Coke bottle and he filled it with soil as we were mixing it, and then put water in it, and he'd shake it up, and everything separated. The sand content, the soil content, and the organic content, it all separated. And we'd be there mixing, and he'd look at it, he'd say, we got it. And that's the way I built number 8 green and the putting green here, with a Coke bottle. It don't have to be a Coke bottle, but any bottle, you know. And Jim, when we get to this day, said those are the 2 easiest maintained greens on a golf course. So we must have done something right. But I built those 2 greens that they're partly USGA spec greens, the underneath, but they're not the 80% sand, they're about 60% sand, which that 80% sand stuff, pretty tough for the first couple, 3, 4 years.
What was done with number 8? Was it where that green is off to the side? Is that where the hole was and you just extended it?
The green made a sharp dog leg to the right, and then number 9T was, it used to be up front and put it in the back.
So where the ladies' tee is today?
Yeah, that was the tee then, yeah. So
was the thought just they wanted to lengthen that hole?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we got that project over with. In fact, the truth of the matter is, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but greenkeeping, once you get your crew trained, get into the summer thing, it almost gets a little boring. Because, you cut the greens, you cut the fairways, you rake the bunkers, blah, blah, blah. You go around the course a couple times a day and look. And I always enjoyed a project because I hated the office. I didn't want to sit in there and be like a dummy all day. I always enjoyed doing something. So that's what these projects, I enjoyed it. And it kept me busy, and I had a couple good guys that worked with me, and I really enjoyed that. But today, we're sort of living on a different planet, and even the Golf Course Superintendents Association sort of takes a dull look at that because you're supposed to be, superintendent. You're not supposed to be.
Yeah, working the soil.
Yeah,
Not getting
yeah.
your hands dirty.
Yeah, so, which never quite fit my world, so. But that's the old, In fact, it was an interesting thing that happened to me at Water's Edge. I have this little job at Water's Edge I've had for years. Bud Stanner called me one day, and he got me, they were having a lot of problems with the landscaper. So I look in on that place 3 or 4 times a week just to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. And the guy, Chuck Leader, who is a member of Westwood, and he quit, he went to Avon Oaks because he didn't want to pay that. He lives right on the lake there, and I went around back with him one day, and he said, "Oh, I introduced you to a fellow, and here he's a green Sherman at Westwood." And we talked a little bit, and he said, "Yeah, that green superintendent we got over there, I don't think much of him." And I said, "Well, I really don't know the person, you know." He said, "Well, the problem with him is he's always working. And he's supposed to," I said, "You know what? You goddamn guys are never happy." I said, "If a guy's working, you complain. If he's standing around, you complain." I says, "Leave the guy alone." I said, "I understand the place is beautiful, you know." I said, "Just leave him alone." "Oh, okay, I'll leave him alone."
Words of wisdom.
But apparently he's a worker. I never met the guy, but apparently he likes to get involved in, you know. So I said, "You guys are never happy."
When you first started in the early 60s, Chuck, talk about the equipment that was here that you had at your disposal.
Well, we didn't have, we cut fairways with a 5-gang mower. That's another story. And we had eventually got a old used Ford backhoe that we were able to start digging with and that sort of thing. And we had enough equipment in those days to do what we had to do. Of course, it isn't like today. We were cutting the greens at a 1/4 inch. That was a standard cut in those days. And another story is when these fairway units first came along that catch the clippings, well, Doc Manco played at, I believe, Scioto Country Club in Columbus, and they were catching the clippings. So he come back, he says, "Chuck, we got to get those mowers." He said, "Get a price and we'll see what." So I got a hold of the guys, and Toro had the mower. There were 3-gang at the time instead of 5-gang. They had the baskets on them, 15,000 a piece. It was 45. We needed 3 of them. So we had a meeting here in that room right there next to this room with the finance committee. And Doc says, "Look," he said, we got to get these mowers." He says, "We just got to get these mowers. And if you would lend us some money, 45,000, when our budget comes along in the fall, we'll pay you back." So they finally agreed to it. So I went and got the mowers, and we started catch the clippings on the, which made a nice difference, you know. So here budget time comes around. Same room, same guys. "Well, Doc, you know," he said, "Hey," he says, "I would thought a lot about this." He says, "We're not going to pay you back." I just about fell off my chair. I couldn't believe what he said. He said, "No," he said, "I thought," he said, "we're not going to pay you back." He said, "The hell with you guys." And he didn't. I mean, they said, "What do you mean you're," they said, "Just what I said. They're not going to pay you back."
I could see Doc doing that too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was
That's it.
quite a guy. But anyhow, the equipment in those days, we weren't cutting the fairways as low as they cut them today. I think we were cutting them about 1 inch. And in fact, the 3-unit, a lot of guys cut greens with them. They still do today, the 3-unit green mowers. Well, they come along, and we cut the tees and aprons with it to save time, of course, less labor. And I started to cut. We always had trouble in front of the greens when we used the furrow because they would turn, and they would sort of grind when they, because the fairways are too narrow, you know, for those. So I started to cut the maybe 30, 40 feet out in front of the green with the 3-gangs. apron height. Well, Jerry Sindelar, for some reason, he couldn't hit a shot on close grass. He had to have,
I can relate to that.
so he was off the green committee. Then they asked him to come back on, and he come over to the shop and he says, Chuck, he says, here's the deal. He said, they want me to be the green chairman, but he says, you and I are going to get into a big hustle about cutting those aprons like you're cutting them, because he says, I can't hit a shot off of there. He says, you got to raise the height of the mowers. And I thought, and they were really looking good, you know. And I says, oh, I says, you know, he says, no. He said, I don't want to hear none of your, he says, that's the way it is. If you don't, he says, I don't want to get into your hair. He says, so I'll just, he said, I won't take the job unless you agree to raise the height on those mowers. I says, all right, I'll raise the goddamn height.
Tough.
And then with trees, we worked day and night planting trees. They bought one of those Vermeer tree spades that would take up to a 4 or 5, 6 inch tree. And we followed the bulldozers, which I had permission when they were building I-90. We were ahead of the bulldozers plucking the trees out and planting. And we were planting. And Sindelar, for some reason, was very paranoid, really, about, since the course is so narrow, he wanted to sort of line the fairways as a safety thing with trees, and also the back of the greens as a backdrop. He wanted trees. Like here on 16, the day I rode around with Jim, I see they're all gone. He's probably turned over in his grave if he'd see that, because that's what he wanted. And of course, the other guys went along with it. You know, we were planting trees day and night. He'd call me at 10, 11 o'clock at night, and I just was on my way up from Columbus, and I seen that one of the nurseries had pine trees on sale. You better check it out, you know. And he was into that tree. And then Jim Carney, who was a member here, he gave me permission to any property that he owned in Westlake. I could take any tree I wanted. So where they have the Crocker Road now, we're plucking trees out of there right everywhere. We were grabbing trees and planting them. And I see now they're cutting an awful lot of them down. But that's a different, and these architects, I know that Brian Silva, when he was here, he tried to, he said, you ought to cut, I said, hey, just shut up about the trees. I didn't want to hear it. These architects, if you have trees, they say cut them down. If you don't have trees, they say plant them. If the bunkers are deep, they say raise them up. If they're up, they say raise them down. That's the way they make their living, and people fall for that. You know, yeah, okay. That's the way I see it.
You talked about trees. Was there a nursery across the street from Bradley Road?
We got pine trees across the street from Bradley Road. John Dumish owned that property, who worked in the clubhouse. He has 17 acres over there.
Okay.
He tried to sell it to me, which I was worried about making a $120 house payment at the time. And I called Jim Carney on it. He wanted $1,200 an acre. That's before he was worrying about paying the assessment for the sidewalks.
Right.
And he was moving somewhere to his brother's farm someplace. But anyhow, Carney told me, he said, Chuck, I know the property. He said, they're asking a little too much for acreage right now, which I don't know what he was paying. I heard he paid $600 an acre for all that property on Crocker Road there.